I'm trying to think of some less important announcements that I can give before 8, because I'll save the really important ones until 8 to make sure everyone hears them. How about the stuff I've said a million times? If you need help with lab, meet me during office hours or schedule a time afterwards. Some of you really need help with lab, and I get it. You know, it's when I write the labs, it's a weird combination between, like, when I write the questions and instructions, I'm torn between giving you all this information and being very specific for the questions so you know exactly what I'm asking for. But then again, on the other hand, I don't want to overwhelm you with like a question that's 2 paragraphs long. So it's a hard mix. So again, please let me help you if you need help with the labs. And don't forget, even after you've done the lab, even after the due date, you can still fix your mistakes for half credit. And of course, if it's before the due date, you can fix your mistakes for full credit. And it's 8 o'clock now. And like I've been saying recently, the new thing is for any assignment, whether it's, well, maybe not independent work, but for lab or exams, if you meet with me and allow me to give you feedback, then I'll give you a 5% boost to that grade. You know, so if it's lab, if you allow me to tell you why this is the wrong answer, if you allow me to ask you questions about, like, okay, you technically got this right, but what led you to this? You know, if you have conversations with me, 5% boost for any assignment. Anyway, now that it's 8, announcements. As always, or as usual, we'll do attendance the way we do, where if you're online, I'll give you a word. You email me the words. Make sure you email them before 9 a.m. And the first word is going to be Subaru, like that type of car that you can drive. Subaru is the first word. The other big announcement, in case you didn't read it, today we're starting chapter 8, right? We are done with the last section. We're done with chapters 5, 6, and 7. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 are going to be on the next exam. And on that note, the next exam will be Monday. So I plan to hold an exam review sometime between now and Monday. I'm waiting for I haven't checked my email this morning, but I'm waiting on somebody to email me and say when they want to hold it, and I will hopefully be able to accommodate you and do it when you want to do it. Either way, it will be recorded and posted. I highly recommend watching it. A lot of you guys lost a lot of points by not watching it last time. There was a great extra credit opportunity. So yes, that's the plan. Again, the exam will be online just like it usually is, but if you want a paper version, let me know between now and Sunday. And plan to be here, and I'll give you a paper version, an old-fashioned, just bubble in the right answer. Again, if you miss the exam, you're going to have to take a harder version of it. Last time, I let the people take a harder version of it, but because they were doing it online and we were one-on-one, I let them have more than 50 minutes, but I'm not doing that anymore. So if you miss the exam, you're going to have 50 minutes to take your exam no matter what, whether we're in person or online, only 50 minutes to take it. What else to say about the exam? Just like last time, I will be online like I am right now. You can be if you want. That way, if you have questions, you can just chime in and say, hey, can you tell me what number 17 is trying to ask, or whatever it may be, and I'll be here for you. But you don't have to be. And then, as always, after the exam, we're done for the day unless you happen to have lab on Monday. Whew. So that's announcements. Any questions? All right, great. Let's jump into the next chapter, which is not going to be on this exam. It is going to be on the third exam, which hopefully will be about 3 weeks from now. Can somebody please, well, I know you can hear me. Can you please confirm that you can see the PowerPoint online?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Vance. So here we go. Yeah, chapter 8 is all about cellular reproduction. I'll remind you, back in chapter 1, we learned about those 8 things. Your book listed them as 8 things that make you alive, right? Or not just you, any living thing, right? What makes something alive? And we just finished those last 3 chapters. That this upcoming exam is on one of those things, which is the transformation of energy. So this next chapter anyway, it's about one of those things that makes a living thing alive, which is reproduction. So without reproduction, obviously life wouldn't exist. So that's why this is important. So even if you find it boring, which admittedly I have a few times in my career because I've learned this so many different ways in so many different classes. If you find it boring, just keep in mind it is important, and that's why you're learning it. All right, we maybe have a little time for this guessing game. Can anybody, let's see. Let's see if this works. Larissa, can you see that little laser pointer on there? Okay. So we'll start there. Does anybody know what those things are?
DNA.
Good. It is DNA. Because those are boogers. No, I'm just kidding. Those are something called chromosomes. And DNA is DNA, when we think of chromosomes, you should think of DNA because that's basically what the purpose of them is. There's also some other stuff in there. We'll talk about it later. Specifically, these are, let me see. This is a chromosome abnormality because this person has an extra little bit of chromosomes. And we'll talk about that in this chapter. We're going to learn about chromosome abnormalities. Here's some more DNA. I'm not even going to ask you to guess what this picture is about. But your book mentions that if you were to take one strand of DNA from your cells, not all your cells, just one of your cells, one strand, it would actually be about 6 feet long. So think about that. One strand of DNA is about 6 feet long, and you have 23 pairs of DNA in each cell, so 46 chromosomes in each cell. And then think about the trillions of cells you have. So there's an independent work question for you. You might be able to just look up the answer, but if not, maybe you could calculate it. But how long is all your DNA if you were to stretch it from end to end? How far would it go? How about this? Can anybody tell what the kind of picture this is? That's okay. It's obviously some sort of medical imagery, right? It kind of looks like an X-ray, but with coloring. Anyway, what this is a picture of is lung cancer. And in this chapter, you're going to learn a little bit about where cancer comes from, which obviously is a very important topic. Good morning. So, as always, your book starts off the chapter with the biology and society, tries to give you a recent story that is relevant to this chapter, which is hard in a way because it's a textbook, right? So it gets published, and then you go a few years before the next edition. So anyway, the most recent story that your book went with was this shark. It was a female shark that had positively no contact with males, and she had babies. And you can read about it if you want, but it has nothing to do with this chapter. The reason that she had babies, these things actually do happen in nature. It's called parthenogenesis. That's when females can basically clone themselves. You can read about it if you want. It is interesting. We will never talk about it again in this chapter. You can go this whole semester without understanding what parthenogenesis is, but look it up if you want. That's also the basis of Jurassic Park, the first one. Remember, they were all females, and the question was, someone said, well, how do you make sure the dinosaurs don't breed? And the scientist is like, oh, they're all females. And he's like, life will find a way. And sure enough, it did. But also, this is funny, I think. Recently, I've seen a meme about this thing about the virgin shark. I don't know why it's just now popping up, but there's a meme about it. It's not about the new Jesus or, I don't know. It's sacrilegious. But anyway, let's get into it. This chapter has 3 main bullet points. First, we're going to talk about what cell reproduction accomplishes. Then we're actually going to get into it. Then we're going to talk about the cell cycle and mitosis. And once you understand mitosis, then we're going to talk about meiosis. So here we go. What cell reproduction accomplishes? Reproduction may result in the birth of a new organism, as obvious, or as I'm sure you know. I think when most people think of the word reproduction, that's what they think of, especially in a biology class. If you were to say, we're going to talk about reproducing today, what do you think that means? Somebody would probably guess, well, that probably means giving birth to something, or maybe a tree dropping a seed and growing a new tree. That is very often what we talk about. However, in this chapter, what we're more focused on here is, come on, I can't see it. There we go. This bullet point right here. It involves the production of new cells. Now we will talk a little bit about the production of new offspring, a little bit, and not even the whole story, just a portion of the story. So most of this chapter is going to be that second bullet point. For this to happen, this second bullet point, not the top one, cells have to undergo a reproduction. And in this book, in this chapter, in this course, we call that cell division. So when cells reproduce, we call that cell division. And it's not necessarily that I'm going to ask you what cell division is on the exam. It's just that I'm going to use that word very often. You need to know what I'm talking about. When cells do go through this cell division, the product is two daughter cells that are produced. And those two daughter cells are genetically identical to each other and to the parent cell. And I'll do this right here. Put a little bracket on that. That's a lot. Every bit of that is important. You need to know for the exam, when we're talking about this cellular division, I mean, I'll tell you exactly what it's called later. It's called mitosis. But anyway, when we go through mitosis, the products are two daughter cells that are genetically identical to each other and the parent cell. You need to know that for the exam. And hopefully by now you've done the pre-lab, in which case you've already read this in the introduction, in which case you've already answered this question, and you probably already know this. Speaking of the lab, this is a good announcement that I forgot to mention. If this is an online lab, so if you finish it before Monday or Wednesday, whichever day it is, you need to come out online, and I have graded it before then, you don't have to come to lab that day. Because the only thing we're going to do in lab is I'll be there, but you're going to be on your computer. So it'll be you on your computer with me there. So might as well just do it before you come in the lab and not have to worry about it. But anyway, any questions about the lab thing I just said? All right. Any questions about this slide? All right. Well, the good news is, as important as this information is, it's coming back. So I'm going to move ahead. I'll come back to that concept later in the chapter. So if a cell is going to divide, it has a lot of things to do. A lot. If you watch that video I posted yesterday, he kind of describes it like I do, where we don't get into the nuts and bolts of everything that needs to be done. We're going to focus on this, the chromosomes. The chromosomes have to duplicate. And I like the way Hank put it in that video, and I don't remember if your book mentions it or not. Basically, it's because those chromosomes, your DNA, it provides instructions on how to build a cell. So you don't necessarily need to build up two new cells, because as long as you have two sets of DNA, then your new cells can kind of build themselves up. Now, that being said, and this isn't going to be on the exam, it is worth mentioning that the cells themselves, they do get ready. There are other things they do to get ready other than duplicate the chromosomes, right? They do duplicate some of the other organelles, and there's some other stuff that goes on that we don't talk about. As a matter of fact, if you want to write about it for independent work, feel free. Because again, the only thing we're focused on in this story of cellular reproduction is what's going on with the chromosomes. So it would be slightly interesting to know what happens to the other stuff of the cell. In cell division, each of the two daughter cells receives one identical set of chromosomes from the one lone original parent cell. And you know what? I'm just going to leave that bullet point at that, because the way that's written doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's sort of like a preview for what we're going to talk about later. So for now, if you understand that, great. Let it marinate for a little bit. If you don't understand it, don't worry about it. We're coming back to that, and I'll be able to explain it in better detail and with more clarity. So I guess then, are there any questions about this chunk here? The fact that what we're focusing on in this chapter with cell division is what's happening with the chromosomes. Any questions? Okay, again, sorry, I just realized this is the first time you've officially been introduced to that term. So like we said earlier in the guessing game, I showed the picture of the thing, and I said, what is this? And somebody online correctly said it's DNA. And I said, yes, that is correct. But what we're calling it is chromosomes. Because as you're going to learn in this chapter, it's not just DNA. That's the most important part as far as we're concerned. But there's some other stuff too. So chromosomes are when all that DNA is together. And again, you're going to learn more about it as we move forward. Cell division plays many roles in the lives of organisms. Again, that video I shared last night talked about this too. It replaces damaged or lost cells. So like Hank's example was, if you go out drinking and injure your liver because you drank too much, Well, that's mitosis, because mitosis is going to replace those. If you've ever been shot or stabbed, if you had a hole in your body from that, it's not like, well, hopefully you still don't have a body or a hole in your body. It's because it heals, because that's mitosis. How many of you, well, I can't see you online, so you two, how many of you are the same size now that you were when you were born? Neither one. You can't see them, but they both shook their head no. Neither one of them are the same size now as they were when they were born. Why? Because they grew. And that's mitosis, right? So it's not like you had, 1 trillion cells when you were born, and now you still have the same number of cells and they're just bigger, right? That's not what happened. What happened was you just got more cells as opposed to bigger cells. And then, of course, there's also reproduction. Now, I'll put a little circle next to this, not because it's more important, but just because I want you to realize when we say reproduction in this context, I'll leave it at that for now. We're going to talk more about the reproduction idea later. So this is not a test question. I'm not going to ask you what cell division does. Later, you're going to need to distinguish what meiosis does versus what mitosis does in this context. So these concepts will come back. But for now, this is just an introduction. For now, there's no test questions on that slide. Any questions? All right, the next attendance word will be lost. As you can see right there, like the show, Lost, or Lost Cells, or the movie The Lost Boys, or whatever it may be. All right, here's some pictures. So we were talking about all the different things that cellular division does in our lives, or the lives of living things. Cell replacement, right? So you hit one of your kidney cell dies, you need a new one. There you go. There's a picture of it. Again, reproduction. So at one point in your existence, you were one cell. That's it. You were one cell. When your mom's egg and your dad's sperm came together, at that point, you were one full cell. And then you were 2, and then you were 4, and then you were 8, and 16, and 32, and 64, and 128, and so on and so forth. Because each one just split. And that's how you came to be. And that's what that's a picture of. And reproduction, this is what I was kind of hinting at, but I didn't want to talk about it yet. And I still don't want to talk about it too much because it's coming later. But for some things, this perfect cellular reproduction of one cell that leads to 2 genetically identical daughter cells, that's how some organisms actually reproduce, right? So one amoeba, that one cell, that's a living organism. Like not you. If you were to take one of your cells, that one cell is not a living organism, right? It's all your cells that make up you. But for some organisms, like an amoeba or a bacterium, something like that, that is it. They're only one cell. So that is how they do their cellular reproduction. Here's a neat little picture. I used to think this was more common knowledge because I grew up in Florida and Georgia. So I don't know what you guys know up here. But does anybody, well, it's kind of, you probably figured it out in context, but does anybody know what happens if you chop an arm off of a sea star?
It grows back.
Yeah, it grows back. You can cut off a lot of it, and it depends on the species and the percentage. But here's a picture of an arm that got cut off, and then it grew a new starfish off the arm. So it's kind of neat. Lizards can do that. Some lizards, if you try to grab them by the tail, they can just leave, and their tail breaks off, and they'll grow a new one. And then here's one that's more relevant in my life: growth of a clipping. So, for example, I don't know, if your buddy's got a good cilantro garden and you cut off a piece of cilantro from his garden and you put it in a thing of water, it'll probably sprout roots. And then from that, you can then plant that in your soil and have a whole new cilantro garden. And that would technically be a clone. Your little cilantro garden would then be genetically identical to the cilantro that you got from your buddy. And of course, that's just an example of the cilantro. It's many, many plants. So there's a good independent work topic for you if you're interested. What are the plants where you can get a clipping and grow a whole new plant from it? And if you're really interested in a particular plant, like maybe you like gardening or something, then you could really look it up. Like, not only can I do it with this plant, but what are the processes? Because some things it's really easy, some of it's kind of hard. Anyway, Obviously, everything on this slide is just examples. I'm not going to ask you about kidney cells or an early human embryo or sea stars or any of that. It's just an example. So any questions? All right. So we've been talking about reproduction in general. And I kind of messed up a little bit. I didn't do this 100%, but in my brain, I kept thinking about asexual reproduction. So as I was describing it, I was mostly describing asexual reproduction, even though I did talk a little bit about sexual reproduction. But up until this point, we have not distinguished between asexual and sexual, officially anyway. So now we're going to talk about asexual reproduction. So again, everything we've talked about before this has technically been about both sexual and asexual. We've mostly been talking about asexual, but it's been about both. Now, we're going to specifically differentiate between asexual and sexual. So some of this is going to be information that I just told you already. But again, like I was telling Vance, I try to teach out of the textbook and go in the same order. So if I was writing the textbook, I wouldn't do it in that order. But that's the way they did it. At least that's how I think. So Vance, if I'm wrong or anyone else, please let me know. Anyway, if we're talking about asexual reproduction, here's something you should know, because one of the test questions, at least one of the test questions, is going to require you to compare and contrast the difference between sexual and asexual. So it is definitely important that you know that asexual uses no egg and sperm. So again, I think most people, when they think of reproduction, they probably think of, I don't know, humans having sex, right? And males offering sperm, females getting the egg, and then you having a baby, right? Because that's the reproduction that we think of most, because that's what we do. That's what we see in our lives. But again, that's not what we're talking about in this situation. We're talking about asexual reproduction. So there are no eggs and sperm. So because of that, the parent and the offspring have identical genes. And again, this wording is from your book. So let me put little quotation marks here. I don't know if I like the word parent, because when I hear the word parent and offspring, when I see that phrase, I think of like an organism, like a human and a baby, or a koala and its baby, right? But it's not that. A more appropriate thing, and maybe I'll fix this later, it should say the parent cell, there we go, and the offspring have identical genes. Because again, when we're talking about asexual reproduction, we're just talking about one cell leading to two more cells, right? We're not talking about a whole organism, unless it's a single-celled organism. Bringing us to that. Asexual reproduction is what single-celled organisms use to reproduce. And again, so far, this is all important stuff for the exam. You need to know that there's no egg and sperm. You need to know that the offsprings are identical to the parents. You need to know that this is the main way that single-celled organisms reproduce. But as I kind of hinted at earlier, it is also used by a lot of multicellular organisms, like some of those pictures I showed you. Sea stars cut off an arm, they grow a new one. Grow a new plant from clippings. Others, that's a good, again, another topic for independent work if you're interested. What are some other things that you can do something like that to it? Like I already mentioned the lizard. Pull the lizard off, it'll grow a new tail. I'll give you one more. And I guess you can look this up too if you want to read more about it. Sponges, sea sponges, those are animals, the most basic type of animals. And they're one big multicellular organism. Let me show them in the camera. It depends on the size of what species they are, but they're big enough where you can hold them. And what happens if you were to squish them through a sieve or maybe even a colander and like squish them into hundreds or thousands of new cells, each one of those new cells grow into a full-grown new sponge. So just an example. Any questions about this slide? This is kind of an important slide as far as it's information dense. There's a lot of information on there that will be on the exam. So any questions? That picture up on the top right is mint. That's another one of those things. That's one of those things I've done for plant clippings. Clipped a little mint from somebody and grew some new mint plants. So we're still talking about asexual reproduction here. And now I will formally introduce you to the term mitosis. That's another thing you should definitely know for the exam. Mitosis is what is used for asexual reproduction. So all that stuff we were talking about earlier, the plant clippings, the sea stars, the reproduction of single-celled organisms, all that is accomplished via mitosis. And then a new thing that was not on that list of the I don't like the way this is. I don't like the order in which this stuff is laid out on this PowerPoint. But another thing that was not on that previous slide, which I guess could have been, is that asexual reproduction, aka mitosis, is also used for the growth and maintenance of multicellular organisms. And again, that's information I've already given you. It just wasn't on the last slide. For example, when you injure a liver cell, or get shot, or when you get bit by a dog, or scratched by a cat, whatever. When you get injured, you go through mitosis to replace yourself, and of course to grow, because you are not one large cell. You are trillions of cells that have gotten more numerous. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. Well, we'll come back to mitosis. If that was all we were talking about mitosis, we'd almost be done for the chapter, but we're not. So that was asexual reproduction. We're done for now. We're talking about asexual reproduction. Now we'll talk about the opposite, which is sexual reproduction. And if you've got a really good memory, maybe you can picture in your mind the slide that was talking about asexual reproduction. And if you'll notice, a lot of this is just the opposite. So with asexual reproduction, there is no sperm and egg. With sexual reproduction, there is. There is the fertilization of the egg by the sperm. That should be easy to remember. I think the hardest part is remembering what asexual is, because for some people in this course, that is a new term. But we're all familiar with sex. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of sperm and egg. That's nothing new. Here's a term you might not know that you need to know, maybe because I'll ask it on the exam, but definitely because I'll be using it a lot. When you hear the term gamete, that is the term for an egg or a sperm. So whoever's online, I guess, or maybe it's you guys, my hearing's bad, but if you're online, you might mute yourself if you have a phone call. I don't know if you guys remember, but there was one of those videos where somebody got a phone call and she was taking it. Luckily, it was hard to hear. So if it was something embarrassing, we couldn't hear it anyway. But anyway, yes, the term gamete, that means egg and sperm. So we all have gametes. And whether you have egg or sperm, that depends on your sex. But yes, we all have gametes. So the production of these gametes involves a cellular division called meiosis. So that's very important. Meiosis is for sexual reproduction. Mitosis is for asexual reproduction, because meiosis is the thing that produces gametes. Hopefully this is common sense, but where does this happen? This happens only in the reproductive organs. And your book leaves it at that. Now we're going to talk about the process of meiosis later in the chapter, but that's it. So once we're done with that, I'll start giving you some ideas for independent work, because this chapter leaves a lot of things wide open, and hopefully it'll leave you with some questions that maybe you can go and find the answers to for independent work. Any questions about the stuff that's on this slide? All right, here we go. So again, in recap of everything we've just said, there are two kinds of cellular division. And for us, sexually reproducing organisms like humans, koalas, ferns, palm trees, platypuses, otters, whatever. For us, sexually reproducing organisms, we use them both. And let me ask you this. Of course, there's only two of you. It's harder with only two of you, and I can't see anybody online. How many of you have reproduced? And you guys online can't see it, but I'll let you know it's a trick question. Neither one of them raised their hand. Also, I don't remember if they had children or not, but you have reproduced. You're probably reproducing right now. And that's why I like asking that question, because this is very important. Even if you don't have kids, you might think you haven't reproduced, but you have. You have done a lot of this. You've done mitosis for growth and maintenance. You would not be here had you not gone through mitosis. If it was somehow possible that you would still be alive, if there was not mitosis and mitosis, you would still be that one original cell that came from your mom's egg and your dad's sperm. Right? But you have gone through mitosis, because here you are, bigger than one cell. Plus, I'm sure, again, you guys have been injured. and things have been maintained. So that's the one way that sexually reproducing organisms use mitosis. And then, of course, the obvious thing, sexually reproducing organisms use meiosis because they use that for actual reproduction. So when I asked the question, how many of you have reproduced, and they did not raise their hands, they were probably thinking about that bullet point right there. What they were probably thinking of was, we haven't made children. That being said, the whole process of reproduction you guys may not have done yet. You might not have children, but unless there's something wrong, I don't know, that might sound insensitive, I don't know, but most likely you have done this. You have produced eggs, and that means you have gone through meiosis. You have gone through that sexual cellular reproduction. You've done your job, right? You produced the eggs. Well, obviously there's a lot more to it than that, but anyway, are there any questions about this slide? This chapter starts off slow. It gets into it, though, shortly. Good timing on that statement, because now we are done with that first main bullet point, and we get to the second main bullet point. In my opinion, these next two main bullet points are the most important as far as the exam is concerned. This will be the meat and potatoes of the questions, right? I'm going to ask most of the questions are going to be about these things. Now, before we can talk about the cell cycle, and then before we can talk about mitosis, you need a little bit of background information. So the first thing we're going to talk about is eukaryotic chromosomes. You already know what a chromosome is. One, because you probably heard that term before in your life, and two, because I just introduced you to it. But here's a new term. That's not new. I've said it a few times throughout this semester, but because we skipped chapter 4, I feel impelled to remind you what it is every time it comes up. Eukaryotic. So remember, all life forms on Earth are of two basic types, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. We are eukaryotes. We are the more complicated ones. We're the ones that have organelles like mitochondria. And if you're a plant, the chloroplast. We all have nuclei and rough and smooth ERs, and the list goes on and on. But anyway, the point being is what we're talking about here in this whole thing actually is going to be about eukaryotic chromosomes. So that's a good independent work topic to keep in the back of your mind. As I'm teaching you all this, keep in mind this is on the eukaryotic cells that we're talking about. So think to yourself, well, how does this work for things like bacteria, the prokaryotes? And then you can look that up if you want. And also keep in mind that, again, eukaryotes are much more complicated. So you might assume, excuse me, you might assume that the prokaryotes do a much simpler version of this. I won't say, I'll let you look it up. Oh yeah, and that also reminds me, that's another good question, another independent work topic if you want, regarding what we just finished. We learned how cells make ATP. Excuse me. So we learned about how cells make ATP in respiration, right? It was because they use mitochondria. But again, eukaryotic chromosomes are the only things that have mitochondria. So how do bacteria make ATP? And in photosynthesis, we talked about how we make glucose inside the chloroplast. But remember, a chloroplast is an organelle, meaning it's only in eukaryotic organisms. So you could ask yourself, how do photosynthetic bacteria make glucose? Because they do not have chloroplast. Anyway, let's move forward. Let's talk about this eukaryotic chromosome. This is important background information for you to truly understand mitosis and meiosis. A lot of this hopefully will be a review for you. So here we go. In a eukaryotic cell, most of the genes are located in the chromosomes inside your nucleus. So I hope you already knew that. I hope you've seen pictures of this growing up in your life. You see a picture of a cell with all of its different parts, and right there in the middle, that little big thing, it's called the nucleus. And you see pictures of chromosomes in it. That's where most of your genes are located. And we're going to talk a little bit more about genes, a little bit more in this chapter and a lot in the upcoming chapters. But yeah, that's where they're found. Notice this word right here, most. Now, as far as we're concerned in this class, I could just say all the genes are located, because all the genes we're talking about are located in the chromosomes in the nucleus. However, there are exceptions, and you can look that up for independent work if you want to. There's a lot of independent work topics. Where are the other genes located in a human cell outside of the chromosomes that are in the nucleus. Oh, never mind. I should read ahead. So to answer that question is the second bullet point. A few of them are found in the mitochondria and the chloroplast. And there's a reason for that. I won't go into it because I've already shared those videos from Hank where he talks about this. So if you're interested, you can see that. But I'm actually going to put an X to this because, this was just for your own knowledge. This will not be on the exam. You could completely forget that you ever read that bullet point and you would be fine for the rest of the semester. That's not important for the purposes of the information you're going to learn in this semester. As you already probably know, each chromosome contains one long DNA molecule that has thousands of genes. I put some stars on there because the question is how many genes? And the answer is it depends on the chromosome. And that's an independent work topic you can look up if you want. How many genes do you have? How many genes does your chromosome number 1 have? How many genes does your chromosome number 2 have? All the way down to chromosome number 23, or your sex chromosomes, which we'll learn about later. Here's another thing you might not know, and I'm going to put an X to it before I even tell you, because, again, this is interesting. It's good to know. But as far as understanding the information that comes later in the semester, you could forget you ever knew this. But the chromosome number depends on the species. So like I said earlier, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? We have 46 total chromosomes. But not every living thing is like that. So here's a chart. If you're taking notes, you can give your hand a break on this one because you certainly do not need to know anything from this chart. But I find it interesting because here, one of the ones with the smallest numbers of chromosomes is a deer, and it's only got 6 chromosomes, right? 6 chromosomes, meaning it has 3 pairs of chromosomes. That's such a small amount. Meanwhile, the one with the largest on this table is a little bitty rat. It has 102 pairs of chromosomes, meaning it has 204 total chromosomes. To me, that's just crazy. And of course, these are on the animals. Looks like specifically mammals. So this is a chart of mammals. This doesn't even include all the animals, much less plants and fungi and things like that. But yeah, anyway, nothing to memorize here. If anything, I might give you a picture like this and ask you to interpret it on the exam. So I'll give you this picture and say, how many chromosomes does a duck-billed platypus have? Then you can just look at it and say, oh yeah, duck-billed platypus, it has 54. Most likely that won't be on the exam, but I don't know, because that's just too easy. That's like 5th grade stuff where someone gives you a graph and you have to interpret it, but who knows? We'll see. Any questions about this slide? All right. Oh, sorry. And that's another good independent work topic. So many of them for this chapter. Think about your favorite animal or your favorite plant or whatever, and you can look that up. How many chromosomes does a watermelon have? That's my favorite plant. That's why I mentioned that, because they're delicious and because I did my research topic on that. Anyway, let's talk more about these chromosomes. I showed a picture of those things that I called boogers for a quick second. I said, what are they? And somebody correctly said it's DNA. And then I said, that is correct because it is sort of mostly DNA, but it is other stuff. And now we're going to talk about that other stuff. Technically, chromosomes are made of something called chromatin. I'm not going to ask you what that word means in the exam, but I might accidentally or purposefully use it again later this semester. What is chromatin? It is usually thin fibers that are much longer than the nucleus. Keep that in mind. The nucleus, it contains all this stuff. And it's much longer than the nucleus. Not bigger, but longer. Not that you need, let me even put it next to that. This is just information for you to know. You don't necessarily need to memorize it. Here's one that's a little bit more important. It's basically half DNA, half protein. So your chromosomes, which is made of something called chromatin, are basically half DNA and half protein. Now, as far as we're concerned in this class, mostly the most important part is the DNA part. However, that protein, it will come back every now and then, and it will be important every now and then because they do organize the chromatin, and that'll be important later when we talk about epigenetics. And don't worry about that for now, which goes along with this, controls the activity of genes, which we'll talk about later in the semester. So for now, the only thing that's important now in this chapter is the fact that chromosomes have DNA. But keeping in mind, for the chapters that are coming up. Chromosomes are made up of about half DNA and half protein. And again, that's important for the exam. Even if you don't remember the word chromatin, just know that chromosomes are made up of about half DNA and half protein. About equal amounts. Like I already said earlier, when a DNA molecule is fully extended, it is over 6 feet long. And that's just one of your 46 chromosomes. That's pretty large. That seems trivial, though. It's interesting information to me. I'm going to put it next to it. You know, I don't know if I want to put it next to it or not. I'll put a question mark. Most likely that question will not be on the exam because that is trivial. You can forget the fact that it's 6 feet long and still understand everything I'm about to teach you for the rest of this chapter and the rest of the semester. So again, what we're about to talk about, what we're gearing up to talk about is mitosis, that cellular division. So let's talk about what happens before that happens. What happens to the chromosome before cellular division? And that's this bullet point right here. As the cells prepare to divide, those chromosomes have to coil up. At first, they're all loosey-goosey. If you watch the video that I posted, he refers to it. One of the words he uses is not lint. Maybe it is lint. Dust bunnies. It's all loosey, right? It's like dust bunnies. But then when they get prepared to divide, they coil up. So it's no longer this big mess. Like if you were to look at a dust bunny, you couldn't, from your bare eye, your naked eye, say, okay, there's one particle, there's another particle, there's another particle, right? It's just one mess. That's what the chromosomes are. But then they get coiled up. And at that point, you can look at it and say, oh, yeah, there's a chromosome, there's a chromosome, there's a chromosome. And when they coil up, well, I basically just said that, sorry. When they coil up, then you can see them in a microscope. So if you were to look at a cell that has not done this little process right here, and you were to see that you could not see the chromosomes, it would just be like a cloudy mess. But once they've done this, you should be able to see them individually with a microscope. Again, like I just said, you can say there's a chromosome, there's a chromosome. This will be important for the next week's lab. That's exactly what you'll be doing, is looking at microscope pictures, some of which will have chromosomes in them, some of them won't. And if you see them without chromosomes, or you can't see the chromosomes, excuse me, they'll have the chromosomes, you won't be able to see them. That means they have not done this yet. They have not prepared to divide. And that concept is coming up later. I would ask you if you have any questions, but again, I'm going to describe that later. This is just an introduction, so I won't ask that yet. But are there any questions about the other stuff, like about the fact that DNA is half protein, excuse me, chromosomes are half protein, half DNA? All right, here's the picture I'm talking about. So this side, or this cell on the left, that's a nucleus. It's got chromosome in it. It has chromosomes in it. But look, you can't differentiate one from the other. This one, you can, right? Because it has prepared to divide. There's a chromosome, right? You can see, you can differentiate. You can see the chromosomes. Any questions about that side? And get familiar with that side, because that's what your lab is going to consist of, a lot of this, looking at pictures like that. Okay, we're still talking about the eukaryotic chromosome here. This is still the introduction. The DNA is packed into elaborate multi-level systems of coiling and folding. I'll put a big old X through this, because this is nothing you necessarily need to memorize. But when we're talking about this coiling and folding, we have these things called histones. Those are the proteins that are used to package the DNA. So when I said chromosomes are half protein, half DNA, about half protein, half DNA, now I'm just giving you a name for the protein, which is histones. I'm not going to test you on that, but it would be good to know it because I will use those words again. That will come back later. So anyway, when we have these histones, I'm going to show you a picture of this, but when we have these histones, like little balls of protein, that's just the protein, right? Those are just the histones. But then when the DNA wraps around it, then technically that's called a nucleosome. That's just the DNA wound around it. And I'll show you that on the next picture. However, the next attendance word, I'm not going to say it. I'm just going to show it to you just to make sure everyone's paying attention and no one's laying in their bed with the audio on, but they're not looking. So here's the next word for attendance. I've underlined it. I'm now pointing to it. I am now putting a line above it. Now I am now circling it. So that is the next word for attendance. Any questions? All right. Anyway, let's take a look at these histones and nucleosomes. Pretty simple. Again, DNA is about half, or excuse me, chromosomes are about half DNA and half proteins. So what happens is we have these histones, the DNA wraps around it, and each one of those little chunks of DNA, chunks of proteins that have been covered up in the DNA, we call it a nucleosome. And again, that's not a terribly important concept in this semester. It will come back maybe once or twice later. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because honestly, it's just not that important for understanding everything else that's coming. So this is an electron scanning microscope. So this is a microscope picture. This is what the DNA actually looks like. And it does look like little beads on a string, right? And that's what it is. Those little beads, each one of those little beads, it's a nucleosome. And you'll notice that that picture shows 8 histones in each nucleosome, and that is an accurate representation. Not that you need to know that, but there you go. Here's another picture. Those, all that chromatin, even that is wound up on itself. And then that little rope of wound up on itself is wound up in that pattern. And that's what gives us the chromosome. The point there, not that you need to know that, but the point there is that those chromosomes are really tightly wound up, right? It's very compact, which is why we can actually see it in the microscope when it's prepared to divide. Because again, that is what is happening here. It is preparing to divide. It's getting coiled up. Because when it's not like that, it's just all out there loosey-goosey. Any questions about this slide? All right, now we're zooming out a little bit more to show you everything we've talked about. We've started at the DNA double helix, and we've gone all the way down to the chromosome. And we'll talk a lot more about this on the next chapter, I believe. So the next concept is duplicating chromosomes. As I've already said, before the cell can divide, the DNA has to be copied. And as a matter of fact, that's mostly what we are focused on in this chapter. Because like I said earlier, a lot of stuff happens when a cell has to divide. But what are we focused on? We are focused on the story of the DNA being copied and then splitting up. And we'll talk about that later. So the result of this chromosome being copied is the chromosome then now consists of 2 copies called sister chromatids. That is a very, very important word. I might test you on that, and I'm definitely going to use it later. It will be very, very, very important. Sister chromatid, I'll put a big star next to it. Make sure you know what a sister chromatid is. Here's a little animation for you. Here's a chromosome that has not been prepared for duplication. All right? But then when it prepares for duplication, now we have 2 of them. And each one of those things is called a sister chromatid. It contains identical genes. It is joined together at a waist right here called the centromere. Actually, I'll just show you the next slide because it's better than my drawing. Up there, you have a single chromosome at the very top. Then it's getting ready for cellular reproduction, cellular division, however you want to say it. So it duplicates itself. And at that point, that one chromosome now consists of 2 sister chromatids. And each one of those things is identical to each other. They're the same thing. They're a clone. They're a copy. And they're held together here at the centromere. And then what happens, we'll talk about what happens later. Anyway, when the cell divides, the sister chromatids then separate. And once they're separated, I'll just show you the picture. Once they're separated, they are then considered full-blown chromosomes again. So again, we started off with one regular old chromosome. It duplicated itself in preparation for separation, in preparation for cellular division, at which point you had 2 connected sister chromatids. And then once the whole process is done, those sister chromatids are ripped apart. And now you have 2 different cells, each with a full chromosome. Each of those chromosomes is a copy of the original. And we're going to talk about that. If this was all we were talking about, because this is basically a picture of mitosis, it would be so much easier. But there's a lot of steps between this and this. The next word for attendance, since I'm over here, is eraser. That is the next word. Excuse me. Okay. So when we get back on, this will be a while. You've got a long time. Monday's the exam. So when we get back on Wednesday, we're going to talk about the cell cycle. This is now where we're finally really starting to get into it. You're done with this preliminary information. Now we can actually talk about what happens in the cell cycle. So does anybody have any questions? Because we still have less than 1 minute. All right. I will be online for office hours. Please see me if you need help. I would love to help you. I would love to give you feedback on any assignment that you've already had so you can boost your grade by 5% at least. 10% if you let me record it and share it with the rest of the class. And that is it. If I don't see you for office hours, or if I don't see you for the exam review, whenever it may be, then I hope you have a good weekend.
So when the exam review time is established, will there be an email sent out?
Great question. Yes. As soon as I know what time it'll be, I will send out an email saying this is what time it'll be.
Okay. And does the time depend on us?
Yep. Sorry, before I answer the online question, the in-person question was, what day, do we know the day yet? I don't know the day or the time. I'm waiting on somebody to tell me when they want to do it. And then once they tell me, then I'll ask my wife and get permission from her because it's over the weekend. And then once she okays it, then I'll email you guys and say, all right, it's this day, this time. And remember, if you can't make it, it's not too big of a deal because you're going to have a video. So the only important thing is if you can't make it and you really did have a question from the study guide that you wanted me to explain, then email me or contact me sometime outside of the exam review, because that's all the exam review is me going through the study guides question by question, answering what you might have, answering your questions. So great questions, everybody. Can I say question one more time? Question. Okay. Anything else?
If we missed the exam review, where will it be at to watch it?
Oh, well, I'll send the link. It'll be the office hours link, but I'll send it when I send out the email to say it's at this day and this time. I'll also send the link.
Okay.
Great question. Anybody else?
No.
Okay.